Chapter 3. Old History. The bar consisted of one long narrow room, a few tables stretched out along one wall, and some small oil paintings hung behind the bar, painted in the Baroque style of the Renaissance and lavishly set into gilded frames. Around the room hung some large mirrors and a couple of stag's heads, the decadence of a bygone age. The oil lamps hanging from the walls created flickering shadows on the darkly painted room, shadows that danced every time the door was opened by a newcomer, allowing the cool breeze from outside to blow in. Chris Flack sat hunched in a corner of the room, peering over a ream of papers that he'd managed to rescue from the flames that had ravaged his family home. Unfortunately, he'd not been able to save all the contents of his family's great library, much to his dismay. The event had left a bitter taste in his mouth. Centuries of knowledge wiped out in just a few minutes of raging heat. The inferno had engulfed the house so quickly that he was not only thankful for saving a few things, but also that he'd managed to get out at all. He was certainly glad that he'd possessed the foresight to move the most important books to another location some time ago. The arson had obviously been well planned and staged perfectly to look like an accident. The police and fire service had been of no help. Any evidence of an accelerant had been carefully concealed. Their conclusion had been that a spark from some old wiring had started the blaze that soon spread to the tapestries on the walls before finally engulfing the rest of the house. A conclusion that Chris ardently disagreed with, as he knew things that they did not, but could not disclose to them. Nevertheless, he had still hoped that once the wreckage had cooled down, he would be able to enter and check whether the contents of the safe room were still intact. Sir Christopher Wren had designed the room in the 17th century, and Chris was mildly optimistic that the fire would not have penetrated the great iron doors that had been placed along the passageway leading down into the maze of cellars that ran underneath the house. Much of the cellar network had been waterlogged for years, giving him hope that the fire would not have reached all the way to the room at the end of those remarkable stoneworks. Wren had spent a lot of time designing the hideaway, one of many dotted around the country. Originally to be used by members of the royal family, if ever the need to seek salvation arose. A number of royalist families had commissioned such rooms during the decades after the beheading of Charles I. They'd not wanted to see that ever happen again. Once the monarchy had become firmly established back on the throne, and the threat of civil war seemed unlikely to reoccur, many of these rooms had been converted to hold important family documents and secrets, of which this room was no exception. He had returned to the house several days after the fire, and as luck would have it, discovered, as he had hoped, that the fire had not penetrated that far along the cellar network. He had taken some time to carefully make his way along the passages. Fallen timbers from the floor above littered the corridors, and in some places where the ceiling hadn't completely fallen through, beams had precariously wedged themselves. The slightest vibration would have caused them to continue their downward collapse that could at best easily trap him within the passageway, and at worst strike him down. Weaving through the debris, he had eventually made it to the room and managed to unlock the final great door. Discovering all was still intact, he retrieved the relevant papers. The very same papers he was now engrossed in reading by the flickering light of the oil lamps. Chris looked up from behind the papers as the door to the bar noisily opened. He noticed that he was shaking slightly, which may have been to do with the previous events, although more likely was a result of the massive amounts of both caffeine and nicotine that now coursed through his veins. He never had learnt when to stop drinking coffee on an empty stomach. Whilst he'd noticed the couple that had walked in, he'd not paid them a second thought. The man had a hood up, as it was raining outside, and the girl's face had been obscured by one of the wall-mounted oil lamps. So Chris had returned to peering through his papers. That was until the dim light by which he'd been reading was interrupted, and a ring, his ring in fact, bounced noisily across the table towards him. Looking up to see what had caused the interference, he almost let out a gasp of surprise as he met the eyes of the person blocking his light. Those dark-set, probing eyes peering down at him from under that cavernous hood. It did not matter how dimly lit the place was, he would always recognise that look, a penetrating look that bore straight through you, delving deep into your very soul to snatch your darkest secrets. Those piercing eyes had always sent a shiver down his spine. There was something unnatural about that gaze. It had been the main reason why he'd originally nicknamed James Ghost. He was unable to believe that anything living should possess such a look, although he'd never mentioned this to his friend. "I see she found you then," he stated before the man towering above could address him. "I wondered how long it would take you. I wasn't sure if you would come with her or not," Chris added, picking up his ring and replacing it back where it belonged. James slowly removed his hood, and without dropping his gaze from his old friend, pulled up a chair and sat down. "I'll give you guys some space to catch up," Rachel said, noticing the intensity of the eye contact. "Well, are you going to speak to me, or are you just going to sit there staring? I am real, you know. Not dead. Well, at least, not yet," Chris said with half a smile, trying to break the ice. "I can see that. However, a ghost might be more welcome sight at this point. You have a lot to answer for, and I'm not sure I want to hear the half of it." James was obviously tense. Chris could hear the slight hint of anger shaking in his voice. The knuckles of James's tightly clenched fists on the table were turning white. "What mess have you got me involved in now? Not to mention, what the hell have you been up to for the past 5 years? You better not have got me involved in another one of those crazy stunts. I don't do that now. I'm retired." James was shaking, the anger now more evident in his voice. "Yes, I suppose I deserve that. Maybe I should have kept in contact, but I didn't think it was wise, not until I was sure. Sorry. And I'm also sorry to hear about the loss of your fiancée. I know I never had the opportunity to meet her, but I heard that she was the picture of Alec." James's fist slammed onto the table. The loud crash of fist on wood echoed around the room, causing a few of the regular patrons to turn their heads in surprise to see what the commotion was about. "Don't you ever talk about her. You have no right. That ended when you left." "I'm sorry. Nevertheless, the statement still stands. Remember, we once were brothers in arms. So, from one brother to another, I am sorry. As for the present situation, I'm afraid there was no other way. I didn't get you involved. You were part of it already, albeit unaware of the fact. Better this way than receiving 2 hollow points through the back of your head, to be left staring up at the sky, blankly wondering what you'd done to deserve it for the rest of eternity. All will be revealed in due course, but for now I'm going to have to be brief. You're on catch-up, and unfortunately I don't have the time to babysit. So you're going to have to learn fast if you want to remain outside of the Divine Comedy." "You're really leading with that? Flaming Catholics and your overzealous sense of belief." They both laughed, which seemed to ease the tension somewhat, both remembering the debates on religion they used to have, each stubbornly refusing to see the other's point of view. They represented the 2 main denominations of the Christian faith in England, two faiths that had caused so much chaos in the country over the centuries, sides that would probably never find a common ground on which to base a lasting reconciliation. So what's so goddamn important, and how am I already involved? James finally asked. Well, I'm going to have to give you a quick history lesson, Chris replied. If that's the case, I'm going to get a proper drink. What are you having? I suppose I should get her something too, James stated as he gestured in the general direction of Chris's cousin. Scotch, no rocks, no water, and she'll have a vodka tonic water, I think. James went to the bar and ordered their drinks, plus a scotch for himself. The leggy blonde, whose hair cascaded down over her shoulders, said that she would bring the drinks over. Right, you may as well get on with it. You better be more interesting than my 5th grade history teacher, or I'm definitely going to start to drop off, James said in a rather sarcastic tone as he returned to the table. I'll try my best. For over 1200 years the royal lines have been protected, and they will continue to be. The Roman emperors of ancient times had the Praetorian Guard to protect the emperor and his direct family. This was until the reign of Constantine I, who abolished the order, and as you know, only 2 centuries later the Roman Empire fell. Then, circa 768 AD, at the request of the dying King Pepin the Short, a handful of the most loyal families of his court became protectors of his sons and all of the descendants thereafter. Not even he could have had the foresight to see that the majority of the royal lines in Western Europe would one day be able to trace their lineage back to his son Charlemagne, King of the Franks and Holy Roman Emperor. Or maybe he did. Sorry to interrupt you, gentlemen. Here are your drinks, the barmaid said as she arrived with a tray of drinks. Thank you, Chris replied. Is there anything else I can get for you? No, I think that's it for now, thanks. Oh, can you add these to my room? Certainly, sir, she replied as she left them to continue their conversation. Right, now where was I? Oh yes, Pepin's wish. So, for generations these great families positioned themselves close to the descendants of Pepin in order to be able to carry out his request to serve and protect from both foe and kin alike. They worked tirelessly from the shadows to protect these great lines, sometimes at great personal cost. As the centuries rolled on, it became less and less necessary for these families to fulfill this role, so many of these families became concerned with other matters. During the Crusader period, many went off to Jerusalem and joined holy orders, fighting to protect pilgrims and also to defend the kingdom of Jerusalem from the likes of Saladin. And I'm sure you're familiar with the myths surrounding the Templar Knights and the Holy Grail. Well, yes, I'm sure almost everybody knows some variation of that myth, but I never actually thought that was true. And you'd be right, my friend. The Grail is more myth and legend than actual fact. What you're probably less familiar with is what they did discover in Jerusalem. Along with the vast amounts of treasure, they discovered a book. On the surface, this does not sound very exciting. It is, however, extremely important. This book is supposedly made from the Tree of Knowledge. How it came to be is still a mystery. Upon first inspection, the pages inside it appeared to be blank, and as the story goes, they were about to throw it aside when one of them read the inscription on the cover of the book. For the briefest of moments, the book flickered with light, before the light went out, just as quickly as it had begun. The once blank pages were now covered in writing, some of it in their native tongue, whilst much of it was in an ancient script and runes that none of them knew how to decipher. After careful study, they concluded that the book was sacred. What they could read revealed much about the world and universe, which at the time was unknown. This is, in fact, the main reason that it later became known as the Liber Veritatis, or the Book of Truth, as it translates. They believed that it contained so much knowledge that if it were lost into the wrong hands, its contents could be used for all the wrong reasons, and so they vowed to protect it from all those that would seek to abuse its power. My own belief is that it was the information in this book that enabled the Templars to become so powerful in Europe during the following centuries. From what I know, they used it for the benefit of the order. However, there were those amongst the order who wanted to go further and use it for their own gain. During the purge of the Templar Knights in 1307, some of the knights that had escaped arrest took it upon themselves to smuggle the book and the majority of the Templars' wealth out of the order, and to hide it, to prevent it from being abused. Some were your ancestors, and I believe that your father now knows the whereabouts of this book. In fact, he's studied its legend for many years, and it's his belief that it's not a one-off, but there are several more volumes, although he is still uncertain as to the final count. He has evidence that over the centuries some have surfaced and influenced the technological development of civilizations. Most are now lost. It's his belief that this is what our foe is looking for. Your father himself has come very close to locating one of your ancestors, who rescued all those centuries ago. What about the treasure? Does he know where that is as well? I've never asked him about that, and he's never told me. I only know that at this point in time, the book is far more important than any amount of treasure could be. Chris finished, took a sip of his drink, and looked across the table at James. So what do you think? Trying to gauge his friend's reaction. James took a long swig of his scotch before he answered. Well, to be honest, it all seems a little far-fetched, but I'm sure your assessment is correct. My father always was into historical stuff. I would say that I'm surprised he never mentioned it to me before, but actually, I'm really not. As you well know, we're not exactly close. That's an understatement. You two haven't spoken to each other in years. Yeah, well, we always had a knack of driving each other up the wall. I guess in the end we just stopped making an effort to see each other and just drifted apart. Nevertheless, it does explain why I always said it was really important to build up a close network of people who could be relied upon, and why he kept on sending me a handful of those signet rings from time to time to give those people that I trusted. I often wondered what the significance of the cross was behind the squirrel. However, I don't really see why I should be concerned with any of this. You seem to be in control, and I'm not convinced that my involvement would be of any real benefit. Sure, Dad will be dreading it. Your father thought you might say something like that. He gave me this letter to give to you in the event that you were not persuaded, Chris replied as he took a rather crumpled envelope from his jacket pocket and handed it to James. Typical. Someone should really tell him that wax seals went out of fashion centuries ago, James mused, smiling at his father's antiquated eccentricity as he tore open the envelope. Chris sat and waited for James to finish reading the letter, listening to James's mutterings in response to parts of the letter. He could tell just from the way James reacted to certain parts that his relationship with his father was somewhat less than harmonious. Well, I'm still sceptical, but he has made a few good points, James said, finally as he finished reading the letter. Screwing it up into a ball and tossing it into the open fire in the bar, the letter quickly caught fire and was soon consumed by the flames. Chris never did find out what was in the letter. He considered it to be a private letter of truce, so to speak, between father and son. Nevertheless, whatever had been said had certainly moved James in such a way that his attitude towards his involvement had changed. The question is, where do we go from here? I do have an inkling of what you might suggest, but as you've kept me in suspense for this long, I'm sure I can wait a little longer, especially as our quarries seem to be half a step ahead of me. I'm obviously getting too predictable in my middle years, James said jokingly. You must remember that they've been studying too. They would have expected you to become involved at some point, which is probably one of the reasons why your father had held off from involving you for such a long time. The only problem now is that they've had longer to prepare and have anticipated your steps. What concerns me is how they knew about the meeting place. Very few people knew about that, and I thought we'd been so careful. Either someone has broken my trust, or they've managed to intercept our communications. They must be getting their information from somewhere. I'd like to think it's the latter. I have known most of our network for a number of years, long enough not to doubt their loyalty, and the rest your father has known for decades, and as such are beyond repute. We may have to proceed with a little more caution than I had wanted. Speed is of the essence at the moment. I fear our adversaries have become very close to locating one of the volumes. This is something that cannot be allowed to happen, as one book may lead to others. Yeah, caution never was your strong point. They both laughed. I know you've already been to Catil, but we are going to have to visit another of your family's holdings, Maristow Estate. There are two places that are of specific interest, notably the crypt under the chapel, and also part of the library, although the library may be slightly more challenging. As you know, much of the original was destroyed by fire. Why so interested in the crypt? I've been down there several times, and apart from the old tombs, I haven't seen anything of interest. That's because you didn't know what to look for. Certainly there are tombs, but we were only interested in one of them, the oldest. As you may be aware, the chapel was built by James Piers St Alban. He was also responsible for works on both the Middle Temple and the Temple Church in London. Let's just say that some artefacts that used to reside in the Temple Church were moved and now inhabit the crypt at Martinstow, either underneath or inside the oldest of the Hayward tombs. Ha! Good luck moving that thing. I've seen it. It's massive. Must weigh at least half a ton. We'll find a way, I'm sure. As for the library, a small room was added behind one of those bookcases. Unfortunately, I don't know exactly which one, or if it's still accessible, so we may have to excavate a little bit. I'd hoped that its exact location was recorded in the documents in the crypt, but your father's assured me that isn't the case. Apparently your uncle knows the location, so I'm going to ring him in a bit. What I do know at the moment is that the secret room was fireproof and that it was not revealed or destroyed by the fire. What about our foe? They do seem rather eager to engage us. Do you know who they are? From what I have gathered, they refer to themselves simply as the Glove, a brotherhood of sorts that seem intent on reuniting all the parts of the book. The main protagonist that your father has crossed paths with on a number of occasions in the past is a man known as Lord Norwood. He hasn't given me any further details at present, but you know what your father's like. He only ever gives you the information that he thinks you need and never paints the whole picture. Not to worry, they're not the only ones who have done some research, and I think they will be well occupied at this present moment in time, or at least will be shortly. I've sent them a few uninvited guests in the form of Messrs. Gambles and Hargreaves, so I expect they will have their minds on other things for a while. That won't be pretty. A broad smile crossed James's face as he remembered his two ex-comrades, Ollie Gambles and Gaz Hargreaves. They had both masters in chemistry at Cambridge University, and had joined soon after graduating. They had rather enjoyed blowing things up. James fondly referred to them as the maestros of chemical mixology, especially when it came to destroying things. Ollie was about 6'4" tall, with quite a wiry frame, shortish dark brown hair, and wore square, thick black-rimmed glasses that almost gave him the look of a mad scientist, just without the white coat. Gaz, on the other hand, was quite athletically built. Still tall at 6'3", his short, dark hair was parted at the side, and he had one of those enviable tans. Both were exceedingly well spoken, and possessed the charm and charisma to be able to sell ice to Eskimos, although Ollie believed that when it came to the ladies, he wasn't a closer. That was more Gaz's area of expertise. Something that he would come to realise wasn't true, as years later he would marry and settle down with the American girl of his dreams. For some time they'd been experts in demolition and guerrilla tactics, and because of their hyperactive, adrenaline-fueled personalities, they sometimes let their energies get away from them, becoming caught up in the moment. Gaz and Ollie were both agreed that if you were going to blow something up, it needed to be done with as much flair and panache as possible. No half measures or messing around. To them an explosion was a thing of beauty, something to be admired. So sound and colours were crucial, and if he could almost taste the aftermath, so much the better. This exuberance had often led to a few unforeseen consequences, like the time they'd taken it upon themselves to remove a few bridges along the river Dobra in the former Yugoslavia, and had caused such shockwaves that the Gojak Dam, a few miles downriver, had almost been washed away by the not-so-small tidal wave that they had unintentionally created. James could well imagine that the havoc which they were no doubt about to wreak would be a very memorable occasion, and would certainly cause their foe more than one headache, and keep them well out of James and Chris's hair for a while. I've sorted out some transport to Martinstow. I thought boat rather than car would be best, as Martinstow's accessible via the River Tavy. We'll be able to control any unwelcome attention a little more easily from the water. Ollie and Gaz have left a few surprises to help us if we do need to discourage anybody from following us. I've moored a 9-metre Zodiac down by Ince Castle that should be more than up to the task, so I suggest we'll catch a few hours sleep before we set off. I want an early start, leaving before sunup. I'm just going to ring your uncle to find out where we can locate the vault at Martinstow, as I'm sure he's the only one still alive that knows its exact location. He would have liked to meet us at Martinstow, but he had estate business in Scotland and therefore can't be there. Well, I've never heard of a secret vault before, but then that doesn't really surprise me. I'm pretty sure there's a few skeletons that I don't know about. Here's the key for your room. I took the liberty of booking a couple here. Thought it would be slightly more comfortable than sleeping in the Range Rover. The managers kindly offered that you can leave the 4x4 around the back for a couple of days. They've CCTV, so it'll be perfectly safe, and the gates are normally locked at night. Wicked thinking, Batman. I'll go sort the car out. Might grab another of that fine scotch before I crash. And with that, James walked off in the direction of his car. It was close to midnight by the time Chris finished his conversation with James's uncle. It had been a much longer conversation than he had anticipated. Nevertheless, he got what he wanted.